Zekthara adjusted the neural interface headband around her elongated skull, the crystalline sensors pulsing with soft blue light as they synchronized with her thoughts. The massive data archive of the Galactic Confederation stretched before her like an infinite library, its holographic displays casting dancing shadows across the research chamber. As the newly appointed xenocultural analyst for the Confederation's First Contact Division, she had been tasked with something that made even her experienced colleagues nervous: understanding human warfare. The assignment had come directly from High Chancellor Morden himself, delivered with the kind of gravity reserved for species-ending crises. "The humans," he had said, his four eyes blinking in sequence, "they are unlike anything we have encountered. Their military capabilities are concerning. We need to understand how they think about war before we can properly integrate them into the Confederation." Zekthara's own species, the Veltar, had evolved on a peaceful world where conflicts were resolved through ritualistic displays and philosophical debate. The concept of large-scale organized violence was as foreign to her as breathing underwater. Yet here she sat, preparing to dive deep into the most violent species the galaxy had ever seen. She began with what seemed like the most logical starting point: human military history. The holographic display materialized before her, showing a blue-green world called Earth, rotating slowly as data streams flowed around it like digital aurora. The initial statistics were staggering. In their recorded history spanning roughly 5,000 years, humans had been at peace for only about 268 years total. The rest of the time they were engaged in some form of warfare. Her tentacles twitched involuntarily at the numbers. The Veltar had experienced 3 minor conflicts in the past 10,000 years, each lasting no more than a few days and resulting in minimal casualties. Humans, it seemed, had perfected the art of killing their own kind with terrifying efficiency. But as she delved deeper into the data, something unexpected began to emerge. Alongside the accounts of brutal battles and devastating weapons, she found something that made her pause: the Geneva Conventions. Her universal translator struggled with some of the concepts, displaying error messages in her peripheral vision as it encountered ideas that had no equivalent in her language. The document appeared before her in all its complexity, a set of international agreements that governed the conduct of armed conflict. Zekthara read it once, then twice, her confusion growing with each pass. These humans, who seemed to excel at violence, had created elaborate rules about how to conduct their wars. It was like discovering that apex predators had developed etiquette about how to hunt. She began to catalog the rules, her scientific mind organizing them into comprehensible categories: protection of civilians, treatment of prisoners, restrictions on certain weapons, medical personnel as non-combatants, the protection of cultural sites. Each rule seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about human nature. The more she read, the more perplexed she became. Why would a species that had developed weapons capable of destroying entire planets create rules that limited their effectiveness? It made no tactical sense. Her research algorithm suggested that such self-imposed limitations would be evolutionarily disadvantageous. Yet humans had not only created these rules, but had largely adhered to them. She accessed historical records of human conflicts, expecting to find evidence that these laws of war were merely propaganda, honored in word but not in deed. Instead, she found something even more puzzling: instances where human militaries had sacrificed tactical advantages to maintain these principles. Soldiers sharing medical supplies with enemy wounded, armies that had bypassed strategic targets because they contained civilian populations, military commanders court-martialed by their own forces for violating the rules of engagement. One particular case study caught her attention: the story of a human medical officer named Clara Barton during something called the American Civil War. Despite the brutal nature of the conflict, Barton had treated wounded soldiers from both sides equally, often putting herself in danger to reach injured enemies. The concept was so alien to Zekthara that she had to run multiple verification protocols to ensure the data was accurate. Her research chamber grew quiet as she pondered these revelations. The other species in the Confederation had their own approaches to conflict resolution. The insectoid hive mind avoided violence through collective consciousness. The energy beings of Luxara simply could not comprehend physical harm. The robotic mechanicus calculated optimal outcomes and submitted to superior logic. But humans seemed to embrace contradiction. As the local star set beyond the research facility's transparent walls, casting long shadows across her workspace, Zekthara began to formulate her first hypothesis. Perhaps these laws of war were not limitations at all, but rather a different kind of strength. Maybe the true measure of human military might was not in their capacity for destruction, but in their ability to restrain that capacity. She opened a new research file, labeled it Preliminary Observations, and began to type her initial notes. The humans were paradoxical. They were simultaneously the most violent and most civilized species she had encountered. They could level cities but chose to protect hospitals. They could poison entire atmospheres but banned chemical weapons. They could eliminate entire populations but instead created refugee protection protocols. Tomorrow, she decided she would dig deeper into specific examples. She needed to understand not just what these laws were, but how they worked in practice. How did humans balance their warrior nature with their moral constraints? What happened when these two aspects of their character came into conflict? As she powered down her research interface, Zekthara realized that studying human warfare was going to be far more complex than she had initially anticipated. These creatures were not simply efficient killers or noble peacekeepers. They were something far more dangerous and far more admirable. They were beings who could choose. The soft hum of the facility's environmental systems provided a gentle backdrop as she made her way to her quarters. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new contradictions, and new questions about the species that had somehow learned to wage war with honor. For the first time since accepting this assignment, Zekthara felt a stirring of something unexpected: respect. The second day of research brought Zekthara face to face with something that challenged every assumption she held about intelligent behavior: the human concept of war crimes. She materialized a cup of nutrition gel and settled into her analysis chair, the soft bioluminescent panels around her workspace adjusting to optimal learning conditions. Her first case study appeared in the holographic display with stark, uncompromising detail: the Nuremberg trials. She watched in fascination as humans prosecuted their own species for violations of their laws of war. The paradox struck her immediately. These creatures had fought the most devastating conflict in their planetary history, emerged victorious, and then proceeded to put both their enemies and their own people on trial for how they had conducted the war. The concept was so foreign that her neural implants struggled to process it. In every other species she had studied, victory in conflict was absolute. The Krita consumed their defeated enemies entirely. The Void Hunters enslaved conquered populations. The Zephyrian Empire simply erased opposing cultures from existence. But humans had created courts to judge their own actions in victory. She accessed the trial records, watching as human prosecutors presented evidence against human defendants. The charges were precise: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Each accusation carried the weight of human law, backed by evidence and testimony. What struck her most was not the existence of these trials, but the fact that humans had created them voluntarily. No external force had compelled them to examine their own conduct. The deeper she delved, the more complex the picture became. She discovered that humans had a phrase for this behavior: holding ourselves accountable. It was a concept that required her universal translator to run multiple interpretation cycles before producing something approximating understanding in her native language. Her research led her to examine specific incidents where humans had reported their own violations. She found records of soldiers who had witnessed illegal acts and reported them to their superiors, knowing it would result in investigations of their own units. She discovered military officers who had court-martialed subordinates for following orders that violated the laws of war, even when those violations might have been tactically advantageous. One case particularly captured her attention: a human military whistleblower named Hugh Thompson Jr., who had intervened to stop a massacre during something called the Vietnam War. Thompson had not only prevented further killings, but had later testified against his own military when investigations began. The personal cost to Thompson had been severe: ostracism from his peers, threats to his life, decades of controversy. Yet he had persisted in his testimony. Zekthara paused her research to consider the implications. Thompson had prioritized abstract principles over personal safety, tribal loyalty, and military hierarchy. He had chosen to uphold laws that existed only because his species had decided they should exist. The circular logic was dizzying. Humans created moral constraints on their own behavior and then sacrificed their own interests to uphold those constraints. She expanded her analysis to examine how these principles functioned across different human cultures and time periods. The results were remarkably consistent. From ancient codes of chivalry to modern military justice systems, humans repeatedly demonstrated the same pattern. They would limit their own effectiveness in combat to maintain their ethical standards. The research revealed another puzzling element. Human military training specifically included instruction in the laws of war. New soldiers were taught not only how to kill efficiently but also how to kill ethically. They learned to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, to respect surrender, to treat prisoners humanely, and to protect medical personnel and facilities. What made this even more remarkable was that humans knew their enemies might not follow the same rules. Historical records showed numerous instances where human forces adhered to the laws of war, even when fighting opponents who flagrantly violated them. They maintained medical neutrality while being targeted by enemy forces. They treated prisoners well despite evidence that their own captured personnel were being abused. They protected civilian populations even when those populations were providing support to enemy combatants. Zekthara's analytical protocols suggested this behavior was strategically inefficient. Unilateral adherence to limiting principles while facing opponents who ignored such limitations should have been catastrophically disadvantageous. Yet humans had not only survived but had often prevailed in such conflicts. She began to examine the long-term consequences of this approach. Slowly, a pattern emerged that her initial analysis had missed. Human adherence to their laws of war had created something unprecedented in galactic history: trust among enemies. Even species that had fought bitter wars with humans eventually came to respect their military conduct. The research archives contained testimony from former human adversaries, beings who had fought against human forces and later joined the Confederation. Their accounts were remarkably consistent. While they had feared human military capability, they had also come to respect human military honor. This respect had often translated into post-conflict cooperation and eventual alliance. One former enemy commander, a reptilian hegemony general named Sistak, had provided particularly illuminating testimony. We expected the humans to behave like conquerors. Instead, they behaved like liberators. Even in our defeat, they treated our wounded, fed our prisoners, and respected our dead. This was not weakness, it was strength of a kind we had never encountered. Zekthara realized she was witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about evolutionary strategy. Humans had developed a form of warfare that was simultaneously effective and morally constrained. They had created a system where victory was measured not only by tactical success, but by ethical compliance. As the day's research session concluded, she found herself grappling with a growing appreciation for human complexity. These beings had taken warfare, the most primal and brutal aspect of competition, and had somehow civilized it without eliminating its effectiveness. They had created rules for activities that, by definition, involved breaking the ultimate rule against killing. Her preliminary conclusion was forming. Human laws of war were not signs of weakness or inefficiency, but rather evidence of a sophisticated understanding of long-term strategic thinking. By constraining their own behavior, humans had gained something more valuable than tactical advantage. They had gained moral authority. Tomorrow, she decided, she would examine how these principles worked in practice during actual combat situations. She needed to understand not just the theory of human military ethics, but how they functioned when tested by the chaos and pressure of real warfare. Zekthara's third day of research began with a decision that would fundamentally change her understanding of human warfare. She would examine battlefield recordings from actual human conflicts. The Confederation's intelligence archives contained thousands of hours of combat footage, communication intercepts, and after-action reports. What she discovered challenged every preconception she held about how rational beings should behave under extreme stress. Her first case study emerged from what humans called the Battle of Fallujah during their Iraq War. She watched through multiple camera angles as human soldiers moved through urban terrain, engaging enemy combatants while simultaneously coordinating with medical personnel, protecting civilian evacuees, and maintaining strict rules of engagement even under heavy fire. The complexity was staggering. Human soldiers were required to make split-second decisions that considered not only tactical effectiveness, but also legal compliance and moral implications. They had to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in chaotic environments, where such distinctions were often unclear. They had to balance force protection with civilian protection, mission accomplishment with ethical compliance. What struck Zekthara most forcefully was a recorded radio exchange between a human commander and his subordinates. Enemy fighters had taken positions in a mosque, using it as a base for attacks on human forces. The tactical solution was obvious: destroy the building and eliminate the threat. Instead, she listened to a lengthy discussion about the rules of engagement regarding religious sites, alternative approaches that might minimize cultural damage, and the importance of distinguishing between the sacred nature of the building and the illegitimate use to which it was being put. The human commander ultimately authorized an assault that was tactically more dangerous for his own forces but preserved the religious structure. Several human soldiers were wounded in the subsequent fighting, casualties that could have been avoided with more destructive tactics. Yet the radio recordings revealed no regret from the command structure, only satisfaction that they had upheld their principles while accomplishing their mission. Zekthara ran probability analyses on this decision. By any objective measure, the human commander had chosen a course of action that increased risk to his own forces while providing no tangible military advantage. From a purely evolutionary perspective, this should have been selected against over time. Species that prioritized abstract principles over survival should not have survived long enough to reach spacefaring capability. Yet here was evidence that such decision-making was not only common among humans but was actually institutionalized in their military doctrine. She discovered training manuals that explicitly taught commanders to consider ethical implications alongside tactical requirements. Military academies where future officers studied philosophy alongside strategy. Promotion systems that evaluated moral courage alongside physical bravery. Her analysis expanded to examine human medical personnel in combat zones. The Geneva Conventions designated medical personnel as non-combatants, requiring them to treat wounded from all sides equally, and forbidding them from participating directly in hostilities. What fascinated Zekthara was that humans actually followed these rules, even when it put them at severe disadvantage. She found recordings of human medics treating enemy wounded while under fire from other enemy forces. She discovered accounts of human medical facilities that had provided treatment to injured enemy combatants, sometimes while those same combatants' allies were attacking the hospital. The logic was circular and, by any reasonable standard, self-defeating. Humans would heal their enemies so those enemies could return to fighting them. One particular incident stood out in her analysis. During a conflict on a human colony world, a human field medic named Sarah Chen had spent 3 hours treating wounded enemy soldiers while her own unit was pinned down by hostile fire. Chen had used her limited medical supplies to stabilize enemy casualties, knowing that doing so reduced her ability to treat her own people if they were wounded. When questioned during a post-action debrief, Chen's response had been recorded. They stopped being enemies when they became patients. My job is to preserve life, not to decide which lives are worth preserving. The statement was simultaneously simple and profound, representing a compartmentalization of identity and duty that seemed uniquely human. Zekthara began to understand that human military ethics were not merely theoretical constructs but practical frameworks that shaped behavior under extreme stress. Human soldiers were trained to maintain their moral constraints even when those constraints were tactically disadvantageous. Personally dangerous or strategically questionable, she examined counterexamples. Seeking instances where humans had abandoned their principles under pressure, she found them, but they were treated by human military institutions as failures rather than understandable adaptations to extreme circumstances. Humans who violated the laws of war were court-martialed, cashiered, and often imprisoned by their own forces. The message was clear. Maintaining ethical standards was more important than achieving tactical success. The research led her to examine human prisoner-of-war facilities. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment of captured enemy personnel, including adequate food, medical care, and protection from abuse. Zekthara expected to find evidence that these requirements were ignored in practice, particularly during intense conflicts. Instead, she discovered elaborate systems designed to ensure compliance with prisoner treatment standards. Human military police units specifically trained in detention operations, regular inspections by neutral parties, detailed records of prisoner health and welfare. In some cases, enemy prisoners received better medical care than was available to civilian populations in the same region. The economic cost of these principles was substantial. Maintaining prisoner of war camps according to human standards required significant resources that could have been used for combat operations. Providing medical care to enemy wounded diverted supplies from human forces. Protecting civilian populations slowed military advances and complicated tactical planning. Yet humans consistently chose to bear these costs rather than abandon their principles. They had created a form of warfare that was simultaneously effective and expensive, brutal and humane, efficient and morally constrained. The contradiction seemed impossible to reconcile, yet somehow humans had made them work. As her third day of research concluded, Zekthara found herself struggling with a growing sense of admiration for human military culture. These beings had not simply developed effective ways to kill their enemies. They had developed effective ways to remain civilized while killing their enemies. They had created ethical frameworks that functioned under the most extreme stress any sapient being could experience. Her next research focus became clear. She needed to understand how human military ethics had evolved. What forces had shaped this unique approach to warfare? How had a violent species developed such sophisticated moral constraints? The answers, she suspected, would reveal something fundamental about human nature itself. On her fourth day of research, Zekthara decided to trace the evolutionary development of human military ethics. She needed to understand how a species capable of such devastating violence had simultaneously developed such sophisticated moral constraints. The historical archives revealed a story that was far more complex and fascinating than she had anticipated. She began with humanity's earliest recorded conflicts, expecting to find primitive brutality that gradually evolved into more civilized forms of warfare. Instead, she discovered that humans had been grappling with the ethics of combat from their earliest documented history. Ancient texts revealed warriors who struggled with the morality of their actions, philosophers who debated the justification for violence, and leaders who sought to limit the destructiveness of warfare even in victory. The Code of Hammurabi, created over 4,000 Earth years ago, contained provisions for the treatment of prisoners and the protection of non-combatants. Ancient Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu had written about the importance of limiting destruction and preserving enemy populations for post-conflict governance. Greek city-states had developed conventions about the treatment of defeated enemies and the sanctity of certain locations during warfare. What emerged from her research was not a linear progression from barbarism to civilization, but rather a continuous tension between human capacity for violence and human desire to constrain that violence. Throughout their history, humans had simultaneously developed more effective ways to kill and more sophisticated ways to limit killing. The medieval period provided particularly illuminating examples. Human knights had operated under codes of chivalry that required them to protect the weak, show mercy to defeated enemies, and conduct themselves honorably even in combat. These codes had often conflicted with tactical efficiency, yet they had persisted across centuries and cultures. Zekthara examined the Battle of Agincourt, where English longbowmen had devastated French cavalry charges. Despite their overwhelming tactical advantage, the English had followed established conventions about the treatment of prisoners and wounded. King Henry V had reportedly executed prisoners only when convinced they posed a continuing threat to his forces, and even then had struggled with the decision according to contemporary accounts. The development of international humanitarian law in the modern era represented something unprecedented in galactic history. Multiple competing human nations agreeing to limit their own military effectiveness for moral reasons. The first Geneva Convention, established in 1864, had emerged from one man's horror at battlefield conditions during the Battle of Solferino. Henry Dunant, a Swiss businessman who had witnessed the battle's aftermath, had been appalled by the suffering of wounded soldiers left without medical care. Rather than simply accepting this as an inevitable cost of warfare, Dunant had campaigned for international agreements to protect battlefield casualties. The resulting Red Cross movement and Geneva Conventions represented human determination to civilize warfare without abandoning their capacity for effective military action. What made this development remarkable was that humans had created these constraints voluntarily. No external force had compelled them to limit their military effectiveness. They had imposed these restrictions on themselves because they believed such restrictions were morally necessary. Thara's analysis revealed that human military ethics had evolved through a process of accumulated moral learning. Each major conflict had generated new insights about the conduct of warfare, leading to more sophisticated ethical frameworks. The American Civil War had produced the Lieber Code, which established detailed rules for the conduct of armies in the field. World War I had led to prohibitions on chemical weapons. World War II had resulted in the modern Geneva Conventions and the concept of crimes against humanity. The pattern was consistent. Humans experienced the horrors of war and responded by creating rules to prevent those horrors from recurring. They learned from their mistakes and institutionalized that learning in international law and military doctrine. She examined how these ethical frameworks were transmitted through human military institutions. Military academies taught courses in military ethics alongside tactics and strategy. Officer training programs included instruction in international humanitarian law. Enlisted personnel received training in the laws of armed conflict as a standard part of their military education. The depth of this ethical integration was remarkable. Human military personnel were expected to understand not just what they could do in combat, but what they should do and what they must not do. They were taught to recognize illegal orders and to refuse to obey them. They were trained to report violations of the laws of war, even when those violations were committed by their own forces. This created a military culture that was simultaneously professional and moral, effective and constrained. Human soldiers were killers who were taught to kill ethically, destroyers who were trained to destroy responsibly, warriors who were educated to war honorably. Thara discovered that human military effectiveness had not decreased as their ethical constraints had increased. If anything, the opposite seemed to be true. Military units that maintained high ethical standards often demonstrated superior performance in complex operational environments. They were more trusted by civilian populations, more effective at post-conflict stabilization, and more successful at achieving long-term strategic objectives. The research revealed something that challenged conventional understanding of evolutionary strategy. Moral constraints could actually enhance effectiveness rather than limiting it. By adhering to ethical standards, human military forces gained legitimacy, trust, and cooperation from various stakeholders. They created conditions for sustainable victory rather than temporary tactical success. One case study particularly illustrated this principle: the human peacekeeping mission in Sierra Leone. Human forces had intervened in a brutal civil war characterized by widespread atrocities against civilian populations. Rather than responding with overwhelming force, human peacekeepers had maintained strict rules of engagement, protected civilian populations, and worked to build trust with all parties to the conflict. The mission had been successful not because human forces had been more violent than the combatants they were separating, but because they had been more disciplined, more ethical, and more trustworthy. Their adherence to the laws of war had made them effective mediators and stabilizers rather than simply another armed faction. Thara realized that human military ethics represented a form of evolved intelligence about conflict. Humans had learned that sustainable security required more than the ability to destroy enemies. It required the ability to create conditions for lasting peace. Their laws of war were not limitations on their military effectiveness, but rather sophisticated tools for achieving strategic success. As her fourth day of research concluded, she began to understand that human military culture had achieved something remarkable: the integration of moral reasoning with strategic thinking. Humans had created military institutions that were simultaneously lethal and ethical, powerful and restrained, effective and honorable. Thara's fifth day brought her to perhaps the most challenging aspect of her research: understanding how human military ethics functioned when tested by asymmetric warfare and non-state actors. The clean lines of conventional warfare, where uniformed armies faced each other across defined battlefields, had given way to complex conflicts involving guerrilla fighters, terrorist organizations, and civilian populations caught in the crossfire. She began by examining human responses to opponents who deliberately violated the laws of war. Terrorist organizations that targeted civilians, guerrilla forces that used human shields, insurgent groups that executed prisoners, all presented challenges to human military ethics that had no easy solutions. The logical response would have been reciprocity. If enemies abandoned ethical constraints, human forces should do the same to maintain tactical parity. Instead, Zekthara discovered that humans had generally chosen to maintain their ethical standards, even when facing unethical opponents. The case of the human response to the September 11th attacks provided a complex example. Despite suffering unprecedented civilian casualties from a deliberate terrorist attack, human military operations in Afghanistan had continued to operate under the laws of war. Special forces units hunting terrorist leaders still followed rules of engagement. Prisoner detention facilities, while controversial, were still subject to legal oversight and international scrutiny. This was not to say that humans had been perfect in their adherence to ethical standards. Zekthara found documented cases of violations, abuses, and controversies. What fascinated her was not the absence of mistakes but the human response to those mistakes. When violations occurred, they triggered investigations, prosecutions, and systematic reforms designed to prevent recurrence. The Abu Ghraib scandal provided a particularly illuminating example. When human personnel at a detention facility had abused prisoners, the response had not been denial or justification, but rather extensive investigation, prosecution of the perpetrators, and implementation of new oversight mechanisms. Humans had essentially prosecuted themselves for failing to meet their own ethical standards. Zekthara's analysis revealed that human military ethics were not rigid rules but rather adaptive frameworks that evolved to address new challenges. When traditional laws of war proved inadequate for dealing with non-state actors and asymmetric conflict, humans had developed new concepts like unlawful combatants and refined their understanding of proportionality. In complex operational environments, the development of human rules of engagement for peacekeeping operations demonstrated this adaptability. Traditional military doctrine focused on defeating enemy forces, but peacekeeping required protecting civilian populations while maintaining neutrality between competing factions. Humans had developed sophisticated procedures for this new form of military operation, creating rules that balanced force protection with civilian protection, mission accomplishment with impartiality. She examined human counterterrorism operations, expecting to find evidence that the urgency of preventing terrorist attacks had led to abandonment of ethical constraints. Instead, she discovered extensive legal and ethical frameworks governing such operations. Human intelligence agencies operated under legal oversight, military tribunals followed judicial procedures, and targeted killing operations were subject to careful legal review. The complexity was staggering. Human military and intelligence personnel had to navigate legal requirements, ethical obligations, and operational necessities simultaneously. They had to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in environments where such distinctions were deliberately obscured. They had to gather intelligence while respecting human rights, conduct operations while minimizing civilian casualties, and achieve security objectives while maintaining moral legitimacy. One case study particularly captured her attention: the human raid that had killed the terrorist leader Osama bin Laden. The operation had been planned and executed with extraordinary attention to legal and ethical considerations. Rules of engagement had specified when force could be used, how prisoners should be treated, and what procedures should be followed for handling non-combatants. Even in an operation targeting the mastermind of mass civilian casualties, humans had maintained their ethical constraints. Zekthara discovered that human military ethics had evolved to address not just the conduct of warfare but also its aftermath. Post-conflict operations, nation-building efforts, and transitional justice mechanisms all reflected human understanding that winning a war was meaningless without winning the peace that followed. Human military forces were trained not only to destroy enemy capabilities but also to protect civilian infrastructure, maintain public order, and support reconstruction efforts. They were expected to transition seamlessly from combat operations to stability operations, from destroying their enemies to helping rebuild the societies where those enemies had operated. The research revealed another unique aspect of human military culture: the integration of civilian expertise into military operations. Human military units routinely included anthropologists, linguists, engineers, medical personnel, and other specialists who brought non-military perspectives to military problems. This integration reflected human understanding that military success required more than military capabilities. She examined human military responses to ethnic cleansing and genocide, conflicts where civilian populations were primary targets rather than incidental casualties. Human military interventions in Bosnia, Rwanda, and other locations had been motivated not by strategic interests, but by humanitarian concerns. Human soldiers had risked their lives to protect civilian populations with whom they had no ethnic, national, or cultural connections. These interventions had often been strategically costly and operationally complex, with unclear objectives and limited prospects for success. Yet humans had undertaken them because they believed their military capabilities created moral obligations to protect vulnerable populations. The concept of responsibility, to protect, represented a uniquely human understanding of military power as a tool for moral action. Zekthara realized that human military ethics had evolved beyond simple rules for conducting warfare. They had become comprehensive frameworks for understanding the relationship between power and responsibility, capability and obligation, strength and restraint. The most remarkable aspect of her research was the consistency of these patterns across different human cultures, time periods, and conflict types. Whether examining European military history, American civil-military relations, or Asian military philosophy, she found similar commitments to ethical conduct in warfare. Human military ethics were not cultural accidents or temporary phenomena, but rather fundamental expressions of human nature. These beings had somehow developed the ability to impose moral constraints on their own behavior, even under the most extreme circumstances. They had learned to be simultaneously effective and ethical, powerful and principled, strong and moral. As her fifth day concluded, Zekthara began to understand that human laws of war represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a successful integration of moral reasoning with military effectiveness that enhanced rather than limited strategic capability. Zekthara's sixth day of research brought her to what she considered the ultimate test of human military ethics: their conduct in space-based conflicts. As humanity had expanded beyond their homeworld, they had carried their laws of war with them, adapting terrestrial ethical frameworks to the unique challenges of interstellar combat. The transition to space warfare had presented humans with entirely new moral and practical dilemmas. Space battles could affect entire star systems. Weapons could destroy planets, and civilian populations might be trapped on space stations with no possibility of evacuation. Traditional concepts like proportionality and discrimination between combatants and non-combatants required fundamental reconceptualization. Her first case study examined the human conflict with the Terran Colonial Rebellion, a civil war that had spread across multiple star systems. What immediately struck her was that humans had extended their Geneva Conventions to space-based operations, creating new protocols for orbital bombardment, space station sieges, and the treatment of civilians on airless worlds. The siege of Europa Station provided a complex example of these principles in action. Rebel forces had seized the massive orbital facility, taking thousands of civilian residents as involuntary shields. The human fleet could have destroyed the station with a single bombardment, eliminating the rebel threat instantly. Instead, they had conducted a months-long siege, providing humanitarian supplies to the civilian population while negotiating with the rebels and planning a complex boarding operation. The boarding assault that finally recaptured Europa Station had been a masterpiece of precision combat. Human Marines had fought room by room through the station, using non-lethal weapons wherever possible to avoid collateral damage to the civilian population. They had taken casualties that could have been avoided with more destructive tactics, but they had also preserved thousands of innocent lives. Zekthara examined the tactical communications during the operation, listening to squad leaders coordinating with medical personnel, engineers working to maintain life support systems in combat zones, and commanders making real-time decisions that balanced military necessity with civilian protection. The complexity was staggering, Yet human forces had executed these operations with remarkable effectiveness. The research revealed that humans had developed entirely new military specializations for space-based operations. Humanitarian space operations officers coordinated civilian evacuations from combat zones. Space-qualified medical personnel provided emergency care in zero-gravity environments. Military engineers specialized in maintaining life support systems during combat operations. Perhaps most remarkably, humans had extended their medical neutrality principles to space warfare. Hospital ships, clearly marked with Red Cross symbols, operated in combat zones to provide medical care to all casualties regardless of faction. These vessels were protected under space-based extensions of the Geneva Conventions, and Zekthera found no documented cases where human forces had violated this protection even when it would have been tactically advantageous to do so. The human approach to planetary warfare particularly fascinated her. When conflicts arose on inhabited worlds, humans had developed protocols that seemed almost impossibly complex. They distinguished between military targets, dual-use infrastructure, and purely civilian facilities. They calculated blast radii to minimize collateral damage. They provided advance warning of attacks to allow civilian evacuation, even when such warnings compromised tactical surprise. The Battle of New Byzantium demonstrated these principles under extreme pressure. Separatist forces had fortified themselves within the planet's capital city, using civilian buildings as military positions and civilian populations as human shields. Human orbital forces possessed weapons capable of leveling the entire city in minutes, ending the rebellion instantly. Instead, they had conducted a campaign lasting several months. Human special forces had infiltrated the city to identify military targets and civilian safe zones. Precision orbital strikes had targeted specific buildings while leaving adjacent civilian structures intact. Ground forces had advanced block by block, evacuating civilians and providing medical care even to enemy wounded. The operation had been strategically costly. Several human ships had been damaged by surface-to-orbit weapons that could have been eliminated immediately with area bombardment. Hundreds of human soldiers had been killed or wounded in close combat that could have been avoided with less discriminating tactics. Yet human forces had persisted with their methodical approach until the city was liberated with minimal civilian casualties. Zekthara discovered that humans had even extended their prisoner of war protections to space-based conflicts. Captured enemy personnel were held in specially configured detention facilities that met the same standards as terrestrial prisoner of war camps. Medical care, adequate nutrition, and protection from abuse were maintained even when those resources were difficult to provide in space-based environments. The case of the Martian insurrection had tested these principles severely. Captured rebel leaders had been held in detention facilities on Luna, where maintaining Earth-normal atmospheric conditions and gravity levels required significant resources. Some human military commanders had argued for less expensive detention methods, but civilian oversight had insisted on full compliance with prisoner protection standards. What emerged from her research was evidence that human military ethics had not only survived the transition to space-based warfare but had actually evolved to address new moral challenges. Humans had developed concepts like planetary proportionality to govern the use of weapons capable of causing geological damage. They had created new categories of protected persons, including space-based civilians, asteroid miners, and generation ship populations. The complexity of human space-based rules of engagement was breathtaking. Military commanders had to consider not only immediate tactical effects but also long-term environmental consequences, effects on civilian space traffic, and potential damage to critical infrastructure serving multiple star systems. A single targeting decision might require analysis of dozens of variables and consultation with specialists in fields ranging from orbital mechanics to xenobiology. Yet, human forces had learned to operate effectively within these constraints. They had developed weapons systems designed for precision rather than raw destructive power. They had created tactical doctrines that emphasized discrimination and proportionality. They had trained military personnel to function as both warriors and protectors, killers and preservers. Zekthera examined human peacekeeping operations in disputed star systems, where competing factions sought to control valuable resources or strategic locations. Human peacekeeping forces operated under mandates that required them to protect civilian populations, maintain neutrality between combatants, and facilitate peaceful resolution of conflicts. These operations required human personnel to make complex judgments about the use of force. They had to distinguish between legitimate military action and aggression against civilians. They had to balance force protection with mandate fulfillment. They had to maintain neutrality while protecting the vulnerable. The Proxima Centauri peacekeeping mission had demonstrated human capabilities in this regard. 3 different species had been competing for control of the system's resources, with each claiming historical precedents and legitimate grievances. Human peacekeepers had managed to separate the combatants, protect civilian populations, and facilitate negotiations that led to a power-sharing agreement. Throughout the operation, human forces had maintained strict neutrality despite provocations from all sides. They had used force only when necessary to protect civilians or maintain the ceasefire. They had provided humanitarian assistance to all populations regardless of faction. They had created conditions for peaceful resolution without taking sides in the underlying dispute. As her 6th day concluded, Zekthara realized that human military ethics had achieved something remarkable. They had created frameworks for conducting space-based warfare that maintained moral legitimacy while achieving strategic objectives. Humans had proven that even in the vast emptiness of space, where traditional concepts of law and morality might seem irrelevant, ethical constraints could enhance rather than limit military effectiveness. The implications were staggering. If humans could maintain their moral principles while conducting warfare across interstellar distances, using weapons capable of destroying planets, and facing enemies who might not share their ethical commitments, then their approach to military ethics represented something truly unprecedented in galactic history. On the 7th and final day of her research, Zekthara faced the most challenging task of all, synthesizing her findings into recommendations for the Galactic Confederation. After 6 days of intensive study, she understood that humanity's laws of war represented something that fundamentally challenged conventional understanding of military effectiveness, evolutionary strategy, and civilizational development. She began her final analysis by reviewing the core paradox that had emerged from her research. Humans were simultaneously the most violent and most morally constrained military force the galaxy had ever encountered. They possessed weapons capable of sterilizing entire worlds, yet refused to use them against military targets if civilians might be harmed. They could eliminate enemy populations but instead created elaborate systems to protect enemy wounded. They could win wars through terror and brutality, but chose to win them through precision and restraint. The conventional wisdom among Confederation military analysts had been that such self-imposed limitations would prove catastrophically disadvantageous in real conflicts. Species that limited their own effectiveness while facing opponents who imposed no such limits should have been defeated and eliminated by natural selection. Yet humans had not only survived, but had become the dominant military force in their region of space. Zekthara's analysis revealed why this conventional wisdom was flawed. Human laws of war were not limitations on military effectiveness, but rather sophisticated tools for achieving strategic success. By adhering to ethical constraints, human forces gained legitimacy, trust, and cooperation that translated into operational advantages their opponents could not match. She examined the long-term consequences of human military ethics across multiple conflicts and time periods. Human enemies often became human allies after experiencing human military conduct firsthand. Civilian populations that had initially opposed human forces frequently became supporters when they realized that human forces would protect them rather than exploit them. Neutral parties consistently chose to cooperate with human forces rather than their opponents because they trusted human intentions and capabilities. The research revealed that human military ethics functioned as a form of soft power that complemented and enhanced their hard power capabilities. Human forces were feared for their effectiveness but respected for their restraint. This combination of capability and credibility made them uniquely effective at achieving strategic objectives that purely military solutions could not accomplish. Zekthara realized that the Confederation's initial assessment of human military capabilities had focused on the wrong metrics. Military analysts had evaluated human weapon systems, force structures, and tactical doctrines while missing the most important factor: human military culture. The true source of human military effectiveness was not their technology or tactics, but their ability to integrate moral reasoning with strategic thinking. This integration had allowed humans to develop forms of warfare that were simultaneously more effective and more humane than conventional approaches. They had learned to achieve victory through precision rather than destruction, to win wars through protection rather than elimination, to create peace through strength rather than fear. The implications for Confederation policy were profound. If human military ethics enhanced rather than limited effectiveness, then the Confederation's own military doctrine might benefit from similar approaches. The prevailing model of warfare as pure competition for resources and territory might be fundamentally flawed. Zekthara began drafting her recommendations, focusing on 3 key insights from her research. First, human laws of war represented evolved solutions to strategic problems that all spacefaring civilizations would eventually face. As conflicts became more complex and destructive, all species would need frameworks for limiting and channeling violence. Second, human military ethics demonstrated that moral constraints could enhance military effectiveness rather than limiting it. Ethical conduct in warfare created strategic advantages that purely tactical approaches could not achieve. Military forces that maintained moral legitimacy could accomplish objectives that even superior forces could not achieve through purely coercive means. Third, human military culture offered a model for how spacefaring civilizations could conduct necessary conflicts without destroying themselves or their adversaries. The alternative to human-style military ethics was not unlimited effectiveness, but rather unlimited destruction that ultimately served no strategic purpose. Her final recommendation was perhaps the most radical. The Confederation should consider adopting human-inspired laws of war for all member species. Rather than seeing human military ethics as a curiosity or weakness, the Confederation should recognize them as an advanced form of military development that other species should emulate. This recommendation would be controversial. Many Confederation species viewed their own military traditions as superior and would resist adopting human approaches. Military commanders trained in conventional warfare would argue that ethical constraints were inefficient and dangerous, yet Zekthara's research provided compelling evidence that human military ethics represented evolutionary advancement rather than evolutionary constraint. Humans had discovered how to wage war more effectively by learning to wage war more ethically. They had solved problems that had troubled military theorists for millennia. How to use force effectively without becoming corrupted by that force. How to achieve victory without destroying what victory was meant to protect. How to remain civilized while engaging in the most uncivilized of activities. As she prepared her final report, Zekthara reflected on how her understanding of humanity had evolved during her research. She had begun with the assumption that humans were dangerous because of their capacity for violence. She concluded that humans were remarkable because of their capacity to constrain that violence. The true measure of human military might was not in their ability to destroy their enemies, but in their ability to choose not to destroy their enemies. They had developed the most sophisticated military ethics in galactic history, not despite their violent nature, but because of it. Only a species capable of tremendous violence would need such elaborate frameworks for limiting that violence. Her final conclusion was both sobering and inspiring. Humans represented what all intelligent species might become if they could learn to balance power with responsibility, capability with restraint, strength with morality. They had shown that it was possible to be both effective warriors and ethical beings, to maintain civilization even while engaging in warfare. The Galactic Confederation faced a choice. They could continue to view human military ethics as an interesting anomaly, or they could recognize them as an evolutionary advancement that offered solutions to problems all spacefaring civilizations would eventually face. They could maintain their conventional approaches to warfare, or they could learn from a species that had somehow managed to civilize the most uncivilized of activities. Zekthara submitted her report with a recommendation that would echo through Confederation policy debates for decades to come. The galaxy would be safer and more prosperous if all species learned to fight like humans, not because humans were the most violent species in the galaxy, but because they were the most ethical warriors the galaxy had ever seen. Her research had revealed that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or tactics, but their character. In learning to wage war honorably, humans had discovered how to wage war effectively. In constraining their own power, they had found ways to exercise that power more successfully than any purely destructive approach could achieve. The future of galactic civilization might well depend on whether other species could learn the most important lesson humanity had to teach. True strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to restrain that ability in service of higher purposes.